The final warning: they built a base in the deep ocean. The Navy already knows there's a base in the deep ocean. Not a building, an operating center that bends water like metal and moves submerged objects at speeds no submarine can survive. We've got one anchor, a 550-knot track recorded on a Cold War hydrophone array, cross-validated years later by a modern Navy sonar analyst who flagged it as non-ballistic, transmedium, and unexplainable by instrument error. The raw numbers shouldn't exist. Yet there they are. If they patrol our oceans, national defense is theater. Carrier groups become guests. Sailors become test subjects. And the few who put this in writing, acoustic techs, ROV pilots, a cable engineer, watched careers stall, files vanish, inquiries get sealed. You're hearing the copy that wasn't supposed to survive. Here's the paradox that keeps me up at night. That base might be a shield against something worse. But a shield at that scale is control. Routes forced. Sensors blinded. The ocean curated without our consent. Your ocean is no longer yours. To see how the base revealed itself, we need to go back to the night the ocean woke up along the Puerto Rico Trench, when a line on a printer crossed a line in physics, and the first quarantine began. Disclaimer: the following account draws on declassified records, documented incidents, and interviews. Some names, roles, and operational details have been anonymized or composited to protect sources and methods. The Contamination, first contact with the impossible. It started at 2:13 local, west of the Puerto Rico Trench. The hydrophones lit like a city switching on. One return, then three, then a continuous track that didn't smear with turbulence and didn't fade with distance. The plotted line kinked, 90 degrees in less than a second, torpedo-killing acceleration with no cavitation bloom on any channel. The watch officer told the junior tech to rerun the filter tree. The printer kept spitting paper. 18 years in, the acoustic analyst, call him Reyes, had heard everything seawater could make. Prop cavitation singing like hail. Snap of shrimp masking a diesel. Seiche hums. Volcano drumming. He'd filed fish schools as noise and flagged a whale as a sub once, learned humility the hard way. That night he squinted at the spectra and wrote 3 words on the margin. Non-ballistic, transmedium. The phrasing was analyst shorthand, not doctrine, a way to mark an object that didn't behave like ordnance or biology. The numbers fought common sense. At 550 knots underwater, drag should climb like a wall. Cavitation should tear a pocket of vapor that screams and shreds material. Every textbook, every URIC chapter, every internal brief on speed limits, all of it said the same thing: water punishes speed. For clarity, any mechanisms discussed in this investigation, bubble phase control, boundary layer manipulation, non-cavitating displacement, are theoretical extensions of known hydrodynamics. We present them as hypotheses consistent with observed patterns, not as confirmed technology. Reyes ran through the checklist: range gating errors, clock drift, sensor crosstalk, aliasing. Then they kicked off a calibration sweep, a clean ping out and back. The array confirmed its own timing to the microsecond. The track didn't move. The instrument error crowd had a point. Hydrophones do lie. Temperature layers bend sound, currents carry noise, and even a loud storm can ghost a return. But the calibration nailed the sound speed profile that night. The thermocline sat where it should. The signal-to-noise ratio was clean. On a second channel, different bearing, the signature appeared with the same velocity solution. 2 ears, same whisper. Unknown to them, across the surface, a patrol craft reported a boil on calm water. No wind, no swell, just a round patch like something exhaled from depth. On the bridge, sunglasses fogged. Then the electronics dimmed in a synchronized brownout the engineer couldn't trace. The radar lost sea clutter, like the ocean went velvet. A petty officer vomited on his boots and swore he'd smelled hot copper. 20 minutes later, their log would read, equipment anomaly, training artifact. Someone told them to write it that way. Back in the shack, Reyes watched the track jog again, 45 degrees, then a deceleration that looked like a cliff. He'd seen missiles bleed speed. This wasn't that. He printed the strip and took it to the watch officer. The officer glanced, closed the folder, and said the word that ends careers: artifact. In that moment, authority didn't investigate, it collapsed into denial. The next morning, Reyes returned to an empty tray. The printout was gone. The server audit showed a 4-minute maintenance window that just happened to overlap the export request. He got reassigned to environmental decorrelation analysis, a job title that means stop asking questions. In his locker, he found a note. Great catch. Stay safe. No signature. Here's the thing, data metastasizes when you try to cauterize it. Within a week, a civilian array in the Windward Passage flagged a similar signature at lower amplitude. 2 weeks later, a Tonga chromatic deep sensor pinged a fast mover that entered a trench, lost to silence, then exited 2 canyons away with a perfect phase-locked return. The old Sosacera logs, digitized and forgotten on a university mirror, held a ghost from decades back. A 200-plus knot transit that nobody could explain then and nobody revisited now. Different hardware, different oceans, the same hard right angles. Reyes still had one artifact that didn't get erased. He'd taken a phone shot of the strip, grainy, skewed, timestamps half cut off. It was enough to reconstruct the slope. He later slid it across a coffee table to a younger analyst who worked modern digital arrays. The younger one ran it against known instrument errors and shook his head. Non-ballistic, not cavitating. If this is real, it's boundary layer magic. Note, the 550 knot slope is reported as recorded by analysts on the array that night and reconstructed from the surviving strip photo. It should be treated as an anomalous measurement pending independent replication, not a settled performance envelope. Meanwhile, everything on the surface got labeled coincidence. The boil on the water, gas release. The brownout, generator runtime. The nausea, seasick. Yet the boat's EM log showed a spike synced to the 213 onset. The magnetic anomaly logger, they're mostly for curiosity, twitched. The ship's GPS reported a fractional drift, then corrected, as if it had been politely nudged. If that can happen to a trained bridge crew, it can happen to anyone crossing a quiet patch at night. 3 days later, a diver team doing a routine tethered check near the shelf break radioed back a strange complaint. No depth change on the gauge, no current shift, but they felt a bone-deep pressure, like standing under a heavy ceiling. 2 divers surfaced with headaches and a metallic taste. The tender chalked it up to CO2, swapped tanks, and sent them back down. The symptoms faded when the hydrophones went quiet. Early suppression came fast and tidy. The internal incident report was stamped training artifact before the witness statements were complete. The calibration sweep that killed the error hypothesis was split into 2 files, neither of which showed the full picture alone. Reyes' request to retain the raw waves got bounced to a compliance address that redirected to a dead mailbox. This wasn't a conspiracy board. You could see the seams where a human being cut corners, and someone else told them it was fine. What nobody knew at the time was that other trenches had started whispering the same pattern. The Puerto Rico line wasn't a fluke, it was an introduction. In a quiet office stateside, a retired cable engineer kept a private archive of noise maps. He'd labeled certain corridors "don't bother zones," places where telecom data got squirrely for no reason. He would later flip through Reyes' photo, then pull a transparency from the 90s and overlay it. The lines rhymed. This was the moment everything changed for Reyes. He'd gone from measuring the ocean to realizing the ocean might be managed. He didn't have a theory. He had a stack of negatives where signals should be. And when you see absence behave like a machine, you stop calling it nature. While the paperwork settled, the whispers grew. A watchstander in Guam heard a low modulated tone just before a sonar screen went gray. A trawler off Dominica crossed a patch of water where the sea lost its sound, and the crew went quiet without knowing why. The word contamination started to show up in emails, not biological, not chemical, but operational. As if a logic had entered the water and everything human was now downstream of it. The file didn't close. It spread. The pattern emerges, trenches, arcs, and gaps. While Reyes tried to keep his head down, a different kind of map started taking shape. One built from whispers, skipped returns, and corridors where sound went to die. It wasn't a single dot on a chart. It was a lattice. Puerto Rico was only the first light. Then the Mariana. Then Tonga chromatic. Each with the same strange choreography. Sudden ingress, a hard-angled traverse inside the trench's shadow, and an exit through a narrow mouth like a keyed doorway. From a distance, the cluster map looked like someone had traced patrol routes on a globe, broad arcs sweeping between basin edges, meeting at choke points where the seafloor drops in a clean wall. The arcs had rhythm, not constant, not random. Windows opened and closed. In Puerto Rico, strong signatures favored pre-dawn on even-numbered days for 3 weeks, then slipped to afternoons like a schedule change. In Mariana, the pattern inverted. Meanwhile, shipping lanes stayed busy, oblivious. But naval exercises in those windows quietly underperformed. Range tests missed benchmarks, sonars. They correlated. ASW drills postponed for weather under clear skies. Civilian eyes kept adding color. Fishermen along the Mona Passage reported silent upwellings that left a glassy ring on rough water. GPS units drifted just enough to make a net miss its set, then snapped back like a leash tightened. Off Tonga, longliners swore a wall of fog arrived with no wind and sat like a curtain until their engine instruments jittered, then cleared. When you pinned those accounts to coordinates and times, they fell along the same corridors Reyes had circled with his thumbnail on a printout nobody was supposed to see. The technical cross-check was the part that made old hands frown. Sosis-era paper logs, grainy, cryptic, annotated in pencil, showed fast movers that transit from abyss to shelf and back without the acoustic mess a supercavitating object would leave. Post-2010's digital arrays, with very different filters and clocks, showed the same shape and velocity space. A clean slope, a hinge, a vanish. 2 eras. 2 toolkits. The same ghost handwriting. Here's where the pattern sharpened. One patrol arc in the Tonga chromatic set always ended near a dead zone in undersea cable diagnostics. Telecom engineers called it an occlusion, a patch where throughput got squirrely, error checking spiked, and automated systems quietly rerouted traffic around a small black square on a network map. The square never sat still. It moved with the same tempo as the trench track. Nobody at the cable company would comment. Someone sent a reply with 2 words: known issue. What nobody knew at the time was that the occlusion wasn't passive. In a quiet lab attached to a coastal university, a grad student noticed that passive acoustic recorders went noiseless not only when the corridor closed, but also 5 minutes before a known patrol window started. It was like a room clearing its throat before a meeting. Active sonar in those periods didn't return garbage. It returned velvet, flat, comfortable zeros, as if the ocean wanted to be easy to read while telling you nothing. Meanwhile, across the world, a NATO exercise in the Norwegian Sea recorded a gap, a literal hole in the operational picture. P-8s flew racetrack patterns and found no useful returns in a wedge that should have been loud with training targets. The after-action notes called it environmental decorrelation, a phrase that does a lot of work without saying anything. The timing overlapped, almost to the hour, with a Tonga occlusion shift. If you lined up the events by Greenwich time, you saw a wave move around the world in hops. Corridor opens, corridor dims, gap blooms elsewhere. Not a storm, a schedule. And when authorities can't even name the clock running their sensors, you feel the ground give way beneath expertise. Unknown to them, across town from Reyes, the retired cable engineer opened his drawer and pulled the transparency again. He laid it over a bathymetric chart and sighed. The ingress nodes lined up with trench heads, fracture zones, and canyon mouths, geological structures that act like acoustic lenses and pressure gates. The egress points favored shelf breaks near cable trunks and naval corridors. It was a design that used geology the way a city uses ridgelines and rivers. Not a base as a building, a base as a geometry. The first internal cliffhanger arrived in an email with 3 attachments: a heat map of null events, a shipping density overlay, and a small square blacked out near the Puerto Rico Trench's northeastern spur. The sender didn't explain the blackout. They didn't need to. That square sat exactly where the cable data went weird and where a fast mover track had vanished twice in 1 month. A square that moved shouldn't exist. Yet there it was, present by being missing. This was the moment everything changed for the skeptics who'd stayed quiet. Natural explanations, internal waves, eddies, thermocline tricks, don't follow corridors around the world and show up on fiber diagnostics. Volcanic microseisms don't open gaps right when an exercise begins and close them as the debrief starts. Noise doesn't anticipate you. Something was shaping the ocean's soundscape with intent enough to set hours and draw lines. While that was happening in New York, a Caribbean ferry crossed one of the mapped arcs at dusk. Passengers took photos of the horizon and didn't notice anything unusual, except one: a wall of fog that stood like a fence half a mile off, then slid sideways and dissolved. The ferry's captain checked his chronometer later and found it lagged by 31 seconds. He reset it, shrugged, and logged nothing. But his AIS track shows a tiny kink where none should be. On the map, it falls exactly on the line Reyes drew. The ocean was no longer just water. It had lanes, and something was patrolling them. The first roadblock, the silence field. The first time they named it, they chose a phrase that didn't scare the lawyers: acoustic null. Out at the edge of Puerto Rico's shelf, a wedge of water went velvet black to active sonar. Not noisy, not cluttered, just gone. Destroyers painted the void with pings and got back a calm, flat floor like a studio backdrop. Sub-crews called it the curtain. Captains rerouted. Insurers quietly added a surcharge for hulls transiting that lane and asked no follow-up questions in writing. Here's why that matters. In a world run by sensors, blindness is an attack. Subs trust the thermocline, the math of layers and bounce. When the Null sat across a contested approach, every assumption snapped. You couldn't certify a safe depth. You couldn't hold a firing solution. You couldn't even argue with it, because the returns looked clean. Too clean. The wedge turned planned patrols into dice throws. A carrier group shifted 30 miles east for sea state. The real reason rode the hush channel. Null persists. Avoid. The first theories were polite. Thermocline. Internal waves. Microbubbles. Good explanations, until the field moved against prevailing currents. Track it for a week and the wedge drifted upslope, nosed into a canyon mouth, and parked where an ingress corridor had lit up 2 nights earlier. When the current flipped, the wedge didn't. Someone said advective decoupling, in a brief, and got a nod. Then the field reversed direction mid-tide, and the room went quiet. Meanwhile, unknown to the ships above, a contracted dive team ran an inspection inside the edge of that velvet. No depth change, same nitrogen load. But every diver on the line felt a weight that wasn't there, bone-deep pressure, like a hand on the sternum. 2 tapped out early with headaches. Back on deck, 1 tasted metal and couldn't shake it for an hour. The tender checked their scrubbers and replaced O-rings, then sent a 3rd pair down. Same report, same taste. The moment the hydrophones logged the Null relaxing, the symptoms faded. The dive supervisor wrote possible CO2 exposure to keep the log tidy and stared at nothing for a long minute. What nobody knew at the time was that a private lab had left a dosimeter running next to their passive array on the coast. It ticked up only during Null windows and only inside the wedge footprint, then went flatline normal again. Not ionizing, the lab director insisted later, just energy dense in a way their instrument didn't like. Weeks after they emailed their chart to a Navy liaison, their lease got reviewed, and they started packing boxes. In the paper trail that followed, a phrase appeared and stuck: adaptive suppression field. It showed up in an internal memo with a distribution list blacked out into a rectangle. The language was careful: environmental decorrelation, temporary impairments, localized returns anomalies, but the line that mattered was simple. Field exhibits movement and contraction consistent with targeted shaping. Shaping, as if the water had a user interface. Stakes went from theoretical to personal in a night. A fast attack sub, holding at periscope depth, eased toward the edge of the Null to test it. The sonar picture smoothed out into the same false comfort, and then, as if someone slid a slider, the ocean returned in a soft rush. Contacts bloomed. A second later, a low tone sat under the noise floor like a heartbeat and nudged the crew into silence. No panic, just a hush. The captain ordered a lateral shift. The field slid with them, keeping its distance. Then it pinched, tightened into a smaller wedge that sat, perfect and polite, over a coordinates cluster nobody would talk about afterward. The insurers whispered about uninsurable corridors. Actuaries hate unknowns. Blind spots in the sea lanes became liability traps. Freight companies got emails recommending alternate routes with no mention of physics, only environmental constraints. In the same week, a Navy after-action note used the phrase, operationally degraded volume, which means the same thing with a badge. Meanwhile, fishing radio chatter turned practical. Don't set nets there after dusk. GPS gets squirrely in the elbow. Fog wall rolled in like a fence. Put the pins on a chart, and you trace the Null's edges. The thing behaved with manners. It didn't smash boats or snap masts. It made space, carved it out neatly, and held it. Sailors joked that the ocean had a doorman now. Jokes are how you cope when your body learns to comply before your mind catches up. Theory fought data until data won. Thermocline excuses failed because the wedge ignored wind. Gas plumes didn't ride up canyon walls and hold a straight edge. Military jamming doesn't move with seafloor geometry and leave no RF footprint. What they did see was consistent. A pre-event quieting, a flattening to black velvet, and a controlled release like the room clearing its throat and then going back to normal. This was the first roadblock. Not a wall you crash into, a gate you're meant to notice. It contracted, then pinpoints formed over a coordinates cluster that sat at the intersection of patrol arcs, cable occlusions, and trench heads. Nobody in uniform wanted to say it out loud, but everyone understood the message. The field wasn't hiding. It was drawing a circle, and inside that circle, the ocean belonged to someone else. The investigation, mapping the hidden machine. To understand why the field drew circles where it did, we had to stack every scrap of data on one table. Reyes met the retired cable engineer in a diner with bad coffee and better privacy. Between them, trench bathymetry, hydrophone logs, cable error heat maps, and a grad student's spreadsheet of silence windows. On a fresh chart, they layered patrol arcs, ingress nodes, and null wedges. The mess turned into geometry. What nobody knew at the time was that the fields didn't float alone. They nested. A broad, low-amplitude quieting would sweep first, like a broom. Inside it, a tighter acoustic velvet, the Null. Within that, a razor-thin line where tone events showed up on passive gear, the do not enter, that nobody could decode. Layered fields, synchronized like a machine booting up, and always oriented to trench mouths and shelf breaks. It wasn't random. It was a grid hugging geology. Reyes didn't say base. He said system. The engineer nodded and traced finger arcs along fracture zones. Trenches aren't just deep, they're structural, pressure vessels, waveguides, natural ducts. If you could modulate boundary conditions, temperature microgradients, microbubble concentration, the slip of the boundary layer, you could steer sound, shape drag, and hide motion in plain hearing. That was the working theory. Not a building in the dark, but a distributed machine embedded in walls we thought were rock and water. Reyes is a composite of seasoned analysts, credible processes, anonymized identities. But there was one problem: physics. The 550-knot slope still sneered at drag. Cavitation should have howled. Supercavitation would have been loud and dirty, a rocket plume screaming under the sea. The track was clean. We frame it as recorded, not proven, anomalous in the strict sense, observed, repeatable in pattern, and incompatible with known mechanisms. So the team stacked known tricks against the data. Non-cavitating displacement through bubble phase control, microbubble injection ahead of a hull to alter compressibility without a collapsing wake. Boundary layer manipulation, keeping flow attached through smart surfaces or field effects we don't have. If something could keep water from tearing itself apart, speed becomes a question of power and control, not noise and ruin. Competing explanations tried to retake ground. Volcanic microseisms? Predictable, broadband, and not fond of straight edges. Gas plumes? They ride up. They don't cruise corridors and schedule windows. Internal waves? They bend sound, yes, but they don't anticipate ships and open like curtains. The periodicity beat them all. A cadence that matched no tide table, no storm train, no cable maintenance schedule. The shape and time betrayed an operator. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the records. At the edges of null events, passive arrays caught stepped narrowband tones that changed when ships altered course. A lab ran a spectral decomposition and found quantized intervals. Too clean for biology, too nimble for shipping harmonics. The tone appeared, shifted, vanished, then returned at a new step just before a corridor opened. If that was noise, it was a very considerate kind. The mapping moved from walls to gates. Ingress nodes hugged canyon heads like hinges. Egress points preferred shelf saddles that led to cable trunks or naval lanes. Between them, arcs traced along isobaths, the lines of equal depth, where subthermoclines run strongest. The system used the ocean's own architecture. You don't build a door in a wall of water. You borrow the wall and make it articulate. And once you move through it once, you can't unlearn the fact that your ship is obeying a rule you didn't write. Here's where the weird got useful. The retired engineer, who'd spent years fixing maddening throughput dips on transoceanic lines, opened a folder he never should have kept. Private noise maps, drawn from diagnostic pings he wasn't supposed to archive, showed rolling occlusions that marched with the same tempo as nulls. On top of that, he had a 90s-era overlay, hand-drawn squares moving month to month near trench heads. He slid it over Reyes' arc map. Perfect overlay. Different decades. Same choreography. A field team took the hint and ran a legal experiment. They parked a passive buoy field across a suspected ingress near Tonga. 3 listening points, no pinging, just ears. On a predicted window, the floor noise dipped 5 minutes early, then a narrowband step appeared. 90 seconds later, a Doppler ghost crossed all 3 stations with no cavitation signature, phase-locked in a way that screamed mechanical. For minutes after, the tone stepped up and held until the noise floor returned. A door opening, a thing passing, a door closing. No police sirens, no fireworks. Just procedure. In the lab, someone finally said it out loud. The machine is distributed, not central. Trench walls as emitters, shelf breaks as shapers, fracture zones as ducts. The base isn't a bunker, it's a field of influence that can harden and soften the ocean itself. You can't bomb geometry. You can only navigate it. Meanwhile, skepticism held the room by the lapels. Could the tones be shipping harmonics? They ran cross-correlation against AIS logs. The steps didn't match prop blade rates or generator fundamentals. Could the Doppler ghost be a layered current artifact? They ran glider data on current profiles. The drift would smear, not hinge. Could the Null be climate-driven stratification weirdness? The wedge moved against wind and held edges too straight for weather. A single detail returned like a fingerprint, pre-event quieting. Before any pass, the sea shushed itself across a footprint that matched the corridor geometry. Then the system acted. That order of operations, prepare, pass, release, was the hinge the whole map turned on. Preparation implies anticipation. Anticipation implies awareness. Uncomfortable words when you're trained to see water as medium, not mind. By the time the stacks of overlays filled the table, nobody in that diner cared about labels. Base, system, grid, pick your term. The pattern behaved like a machine run by intent. It shaped where we could sense, where we could move, and when we were allowed through. You don't get that from geology. You get that from operators. And somewhere inside those corridors, something moved fast without leaving a scream. Whistleblower files, careers broken, data intact. The first file came in a manila envelope that smelled like a maintenance bay, oil and dust. Reyes sealed complaint. Not a rant. A checklist. Chain of custody screenshots. Timestamps. A note in the margin about a missing reel-to-reel segment from an archive transfer. 38 minutes scrubbed from a Cold War tape that should have been routine. He'd flagged the 550-knot slope, the synchronized null, and the printout that had vanished during patching. He didn't accuse. He documented. The signature block was wet ink, the way people sign when they expect to be ignored. There's a precedent for this kind of paper getting buried, and the person attached to it getting tested. The polygraph line always shows up here, and it's messy. Polygraphs aren't truth machines, but in case after case on this channel, when technical anomalies meet institutional discomfort, consistent charts appear. No deception spikes on core claims, wobbles on peripheral memory, steady breath rate when they describe the part that costs a career. Correlation isn't causation. Still, patterns matter when the facts sit under lock. The second witness didn't speak in acronyms. He was a merchant captain, 40 years afloat, the kind of man who times coffee by the swell. He logged a cold burn after riding the lip of a luminous upwelling near the Puerto Rico line. The glow rose like a dome without breaking the surface. His deckhand touched a rail and yanked his hand back like it was hot, but the steel read cool. By midnight, 2 men carried red, map-like rashes on forearms and neck. The clinic wrote dermatitis. The captain wrote, "We crossed something." He sent his log to an address he found in an old maritime safety circular. No response. Months later, his insurer raised his premium for routes that clipped the trench. Environmental risk, the letter said. The third witness piloted an ROV for a private survey firm hired to inspect a cable saddle near a known occlusion. He wasn't supposed to keep personal copies, but pilots always keep a frame or two. That day, his feed glitched the second the vehicle slid into the canyon mouth. The clock on the footage desynced by 37 seconds from the topside recorder, then drifted back. His digital compass spun, one clean rotation, and steadied like nothing happened. The seabed in those 37 seconds carried a phantom shimmer, not light and not current, just a phase shift that made sand look like skin. The office reviewed the tape and called the glitch harmless latency. He archived a backup anyway. 6 months later, an audit cleared his desk. He took the drive home and stopped answering calls. The files came braided with bureaucratic thorns. A procurement line item appeared in a budget after Null events spiked. Oceanic resilience. It paid for hardware that never got named, field expedient arrays, portable shelters for temporary impairments, contractor NDAs with language nobody had seen in maritime work, Transmedium contingencies, non-cooperative environment. Put those phrases next to the silence windows, and you didn't get proof, you got a posture. Someone was preparing for a sea that wouldn't behave. Meanwhile, a private lab with an old dosimeter charted a small spike inside null zones. Not radiation, they insisted. A meter reading grumpy in a field the instrument didn't like. They mailed their graph to a Navy liaison tied to environmental acoustics. 3 weeks later, their lease was pulled. The landlord cited renovations. The lab packed and left their buoy moorings for someone else to collect. On the boat, a grad tech snapped a photo of the dosimeter needle arcing during a tone event. It's blurry. You can still see the jump. Whistleblowers don't agree on everything. Reyes held to non-ballistic Transmedium. The captain talked about a presence like weather. The ROV pilot swore by his compass wheel and the feeling that the canyon walls weren't walls when the field breathed. What tied them together wasn't a theory, it was the cost. Reassignment, premium hikes, audits, wellness checks at odd hours by men who didn't leave cards. Careers stalled not by scandal, but by silence. And then came the line that made Reyes' file feel like a fuse. His complaint referenced a missing reel-to-reel segment from a 197 SOSUS transfer. The exact time window a retired analyst once dubbed the fast mover epic, when arrays caught 200-knot ghosts that never made it into open literature. The gap was 38 minutes long. The annotated log for that hour had a pencil mark, training artifact. The overlay from the retired cable engineer put an occlusion square over the same trench head for the same night. A coincidence that did too much work. Here's where a precedent helps keep the floor solid. We've seen sealed complaints survive even when their authors don't. We've seen audit trails mapped to maintenance windows that cover deletions. We've seen polygraphs, weaponized and then ignored when they come back clean. Nothing in these files proves a base. Everything in them makes accident look lazy. A fourth voice barely qualified as a witness, more like a warning. A yacht owner with a hobbyist's passive rig tried to duplicate a tone shift near a corridor edge. He got a pattern. 2 months later, a defense contractor bought his recording hardware at a generous price. The logs vanished from his blog. The yacht's AIS track, archived by a third party, shows him tracing the arc and then stopping short, drifting, and heading home at half speed. He told a friend he'd felt a heavy quiet, then sold the boat. The composite that emerges isn't dramatic. It's procedural. People notice. People file. Systems respond, not with answers, but with redirects. The data, trimmed and redacted, still lines up. Chain of custody screenshots. Clock desyncs. Invisible burns. Tone steps that anticipate a turn. A missing 38 minutes that matches a moving black square. You don't need a confession when the paperwork rhymes. The lab with the dosimeter had one last entry in a folder named Null_days. A hand-scrawled note. Spike only when the ocean goes soft. Weeks later, the landlord's notice hit their inbox. Data intact. Careers bent. And the machine kept its schedule. The Puerto Rico Trench incident. Human-level harm. It was supposed to be a clean transect. A research vessel chartered by a consortium of universities, running passive recorders along the trench shoulder at dusk. No pinging, no provocation. They motored east-northeast, hugging an isobath that our overlays later marked as the lip of an ingress corridor. The captain had the brief: avoid active sonar, maintain steady speed, log everything. On deck, grad students taped foam around pelican cases and joked about seasickness, the kind of normal banner that keeps fear small. Below, a tech checked the magnetometer feed and sipped bad coffee, unaware that the next 4 minutes would teach his body to obey a tone. At 1942, the ship's lights flickered. Not a full blackout. A dip, like the room inhaled. The EM monitor logged a surge that didn't match their generator cycle. The captain double-checked the panel and found nothing wrong. Then the ocean went quiet. Not to the ear, the sea still hissed, but on the recorders the band fell flat. The acoustic spectrum turned to a soft plank. No shrimp crackle, no distant prop throb, no surface chop. A velvet return without a ping. Human bodies reacted before anyone named it. One deckhand leaned on the rail and swallowed hard. The medic later wrote, nausea onset within 30 seconds, no vertigo, pupils normal. Another crew member rubbed his forearms and said his skin felt sunburned in the shade. A third stared at his hands and flexed them like the fingers weren't sure they belonged. The lab lead said, keep rolling. The captain nodded and held course. At 1944, a tone arrived, low, modulated, stepped like a ladder you can't see. You don't notice a sound like that unless you're looking for it. It sits under everything, below the hum of the world, a floorboard creak in a cathedral. On the spectrogram, it drew a clean rail at narrowband, then shifted up half a step when the helmsman corrected 2 degrees to port. That correction wasn't ordered. He'd felt a pull he couldn't name and nudged to counter it. The tone answered like it had heard him think. The medic's log grew a second page in 5 minutes. 3 crew reported metallic taste, copper, they said. 1 had a rash that mapped like spilled ink across the neck and collarbone. The ship rolled on water that wasn't rolling. Seams creaked. In the lab, the magnetometer hiccuped, a sharp deviation and return, like a compass flinching under a hidden hand. GPS showed a fractional drift, then corrected timestamps clean, until later, when they weren't. 4 minutes and 12 seconds, the passive recorders wrote silent slabs with a single line threading through. The tone, stepping, anticipating, then holding. On the deckhand who'd swallowed hard folded to a knee and took slow breaths like he'd learned to listen to himself fast. The medic put a palm on his back and felt muscle quiver, not from fear. The lab lead asked the captain if they should break off. The captain said, 15 more seconds. He watched a clock he kept in his head and thought about insurance letters he'd read that week. Then the field released. There's no other word that fits. The noise floor rose like a crowd returning to a stadium. Shrimp crackle. Surface hiss. A ship's distant heartbeat miles away. The tone stayed for a beat, stepped down and left. The medic checked pupils again and wrote, normalizing. The rash didn't fade. The taste lingered in 2 mouths, gone from the 3rd. The helmsman stared at nothing for a second, then blinked like he'd been underwater and remembered air. The data dump that night looked like a glitch until you align clocks. The magnetometer. Spike matched the acoustic blanking onset to the second. The EM surge preceded both by a hair's breadth, like a starter gun. The acoustic blanking ended, and the magnetometer shivered again. In that gap, the black box mic, wired to catch bridge chatter and incidental sound, caught the tone that the ear could barely hold. Low, modulated, clean. If you boost it, it sounds like language without vowels, a steady climb and rest that tells you nothing and everything. You're in a system. Medical ambiguity made everyone comfortable and nobody safe. Radiation? No ionizing signature. The dosimeters read boring. UV? At night, under cloud. Allergic reaction? 3 people, 2 stations, same window. Anxiety? Maybe. But anxiety doesn't cluster around a 4-minute acoustic event that nobody saw because nobody could see the ocean go quiet. The clinic ashore called the rashes dermatitis and wrote, likely stress, for the nausea. The crew member with the worst symptoms resigned 2 weeks later and stopped answering emails. His NDA arrived in a standard envelope with a friendly cover letter about safety protocols. If a tone can bend the behavior of trained crews, it can bend yours on a ferry at dusk. The insurer did what insurers do. They flagged the transit with a code that looks bland until you read the actuarial notes. Environmental anomaly. Premiums for future work near the trench rose by a tidy percentage. The consortium's budget absorbed it and moved on. The Port Authority shrugged at the anomaly report. Their logs showed no incident, no obstruction, no reason to care. The Navy liaison, copied on the data package, acknowledged receipt and recommended equipment calibration review. The tone file attached to the email didn't bounce. It just never got referenced again. What nobody knew at the time was how the black box captured more than a sound. The clock on its file desynced by 37 seconds during the blank, then gently drifted back to network time over the next hour. The ROV pilot's compass spin had a cousin on that night, time itself wobbling, instruments not lying so much as being told a different story for 4 minutes and change. The crew joked about the Bermuda Triangle and didn't laugh. Human-level harm sounds dramatic. It wasn't. It was incremental, impersonal, like a system brushing past a person and leaving a bruise without meaning to. The ocean didn't rage. It curated. It made a corridor, opened it, held a distance, spoke in a tone that wasn't for us, and let us pass after letting us know we were allowed. In the debrief, the lab lead circled a sentence. Symptom onset synchronized with acoustic blanking. The captain underlined it and didn't say out loud what everyone felt. If a door can open, it can close. If you can be waved through, you can be held outside. And if a tone can settle in your bones for 4 minutes, it can settle longer. The control signal, language or lock. After Puerto Rico, the tone stopped being a rumor. Reyes carried the ship's black box file on a cheap thumb drive, sat with the younger analyst in a quiet apartment, and pushed play. Low, clean, narrow like a piano key held down with 2 fingers. The analyst didn't go for metaphors. He counted. The steps weren't glissandos, they were increments, precise, repeatable, separated by intervals that lined up with no whale, no engine, no known beacon. He wrote down the spacing, ran it through a spectral decomposition, and tapped the table. This isn't wildlife, and it isn't us. Here's where the argument starts. Call a sound a signal, and you're halfway to calling it language. Call it noise, and you miss the one thing it did that noise doesn't. It anticipated movement. On the Puerto Rico track, the helmsman nudged 2 degrees to port. 1 beat later, the tone stepped up by the exact interval the analyst had mapped as approach. When the captain held steady for 10 seconds, the tone held steady too, like a gate waiting to see if you meant it. We're not talking about a melody. We're talking about a lock. Narrowband stepped, narrow enough to hide under natural ocean hiss, but engineered to be unmistakable to any system listening with intent. Ships don't carry translators for the sea. They carry thresholds. The hypothesis landed with a thud. The tone was a gating code for the field, a machine's do not enter state flag. If you kept course, it opened a corridor. If you crossed attitude or speed boundaries, it shifted, and the velvet stayed black. Counterarguments came fast and useful. Anthropomorphizing noise is how you get fooled. Ocean soundscapes are messy, harmonics fold into each other. Shipping lines sing in steps that can look clean if you subtract the wrong baseline. The younger analyst ran the file against AIS logs and found no blade rate fundamental, no generator harmonic match. He ran it against regional shipping densities. The steps didn't align with traffic pulses. He pulled historical whale call databases. Nothing sat on those. Rails. The intervals were too rigid, and the step timing sat 1 beat behind crew inputs, not ahead of any tide or wake. Unknown to them, a volunteer group of sailors and hobbyists had been running a small passive drift experiment in the same region. Cheap hydrophones, clean clocks, no transmitters. They shared a chat room and a habit of comparing fish choruses for fun. One weekend, a yacht owner with more curiosity than sense traced the edge of a known Null footprint at idle. He recorded what he thought was a hum, then watched his autopilot tick a fraction of a degree without a command. His tone, same spacing, same steps, shifted right before he corrected course like he'd felt a soft push. 2 months later, a defense contractor bought his rig. The logs he'd posted vanished from his site, but a mirror kept the timestamps. The tone anticipates. It doesn't announce. Reyes and the analyst went back to the pattern. During pre-event quieting, the tone held a baseline step. When the blanking field settled, it moved to a second interval they labeled hold. Any approach generated a ladder up or down, quantized, not sweeping. If the ship held steady within a narrow envelope, the tone returned to baseline and the field opened. If the ship wobbled, the tone tightened and the black velvet stayed velvet. It looked less like speech and more like a handshake protocol. A lock looking for the right key, but the key wasn't a word. It was behavior. A private lab tried something without getting themselves in trouble. No pings, no transmissions. They towed a passive array across a corridor and changed only one variable, speed. At 6 knots, the tone sat at baseline. At 8, it stepped up 2 intervals. At 10, it added a faint harmonic above the rail, then eased back when the boat slowed. The lab published nothing. They wrote a white paper draft that used the phrase speed-gated adaptive suppression interface, sent it to a liaison, and got a polite phone call suggesting their funding might be healthier if they pivoted to marine mammal welfare. They pivoted. Meanwhile, a merchant captain tried to be brave in his own way. He let his ship drift into a mapped wedge at night with lights low and engines idled down. He reported a low vibration he felt in his teeth and a sense that the water was waiting. His first mate tapped the rudder a hair. The tone shifted. The captain tapped back, 1-second bursts of motion, and watched the steps echo their rhythm. He didn't call it language. He called it attention. The skeptic in the room still mattered. Could the tone be a byproduct of some larger field effect, a resonant artifact making our gear sing? Maybe. But artifacts don't cue you like a traffic light, track your heading, and ramp down when you obey. Artifacts don't show up in pre-event quieting, then run a tidy state machine through your mistake and back out the door. This wasn't a conversation. It was a protocol, a minimal vocabulary you use when you don't want meaning, only compliance. Stay inside the envelope, and the corridor opens. Cross the bounds, and the velvet stays black. The lock didn't care who you were. It cared what you did. That's how you teach a species to obey without saying a word. One detail anchored the fear. On 2 separate runs months apart, 2 separate ships heard the same baseline and the same step spacing at 2 trenches oceans away. If you can recognize a lock by its click, this was the same locksmith. Distributed, global, consistent. Call it language if you want. It sounded more like authority. Deep architecture, base as defensive shield. There's a reading of the map that doesn't start with domination. It starts with interception. Look at the arcs again. The way they patrol the rims of abyssal plains. The way null wedges harden over canyon mouths right before a fast mover crosses. If you assume malice, you see blockades. If you assume danger from below, you see a shield raised along the edges of our continental shelves. A barrier, not to trap us, but to keep something else from entering. Here's where the old stories earn a second look. Cold War logs mutter about fast movers at 200 knots, filed, shrugged at, forgotten. Our modern slope hits 550. Capability scales. If the system has been there for decades, the tools got sharper. We treat these as recorded anomalies tied to SOSUS era, reporting through the 1970s and beyond, consistent with post-1969 data denial patterns discussed by multiple researchers. Patrol arcs refined from broad sweeps to narrow corridors. Nulls from crude holes to velvet wedges. Tones from blunt hums to stepped gates that anticipate and shepherd. It feels like an upgrade cycle. Geology does the heavy lifting. Trenches aren't just holes, they're pressure vessels and waveguides. Their sides focus energy, their heads choke flow, their fracture zones act like ducts. If you can manipulate microbubbles along those walls, control compressibility at the grain of water, you can alter drag and steer. Sound like light through fiber. Boundary layers stop behaving like sticky film. Flow attaches and releases on command. Cavitation, the killer of speed, never forms because the local pressure never lets the vapor pocket collapse into chaos. You don't just move through water, you move the water that moves you. These mechanisms are theoretical extensions grounded in known hydrodynamics. We present them as hypotheses consistent with observed patterns. From that angle, the silence field reads like a Coast Guard line. You park a velvet wedge across a canyon head because you expect a crossing. When the unknown stays in bounds, you open a curtain and let it pass without touching anything human. When it wobbles, you tighten the wedge and hold. The tone isn't a warning to us. It's a set of instructions broadcast to the system's own sentries. Gate open. Gate hold. Gate escort. That escort behavior shows up exactly once in the dataset, and it won't leave my head. A sub strayed toward a collapse zone, bad rock, old slide, a place where the seafloor can move without asking. The records show a narrowband tone shift to a spacing we hadn't seen, followed by a soft acoustic return that tracked the sub's beam at a constant offset. The crew reported nothing dramatic, only a sense of pressure easing and a mapping solution that suddenly made sense, as if the ocean had tilted them toward sanity. The escort held its distance for 9 minutes, then peeled off as the sub crossed out of danger. No cavitation, no contact, no message left behind. Just a nudge away from ruin. If this is a shield, who is it for? The pattern answers in small ways. Objects that present tone-compliant signatures, speed within a lane, heading within a tolerance, pass untouched. Military hulls that match the envelope get shushed but not shoved. The velvet hardens for big engines that push at the wrong time, the wrong angle. Fishing boats barely register. Research vessels get a corridor if they behave. The rules are consistent, boring, and indifferent to flags. Meanwhile, historical echoes keep chiming. The fast mover, slope at 200 knots alive in the 70s. The modern 550 slope now. If the system's job is interception, it's tracking threats we never learned to name. You don't build gates along trenches unless you expect ingress from abyssal flats, where anything can approach under cover of pressure and darkness. The arcs sweep those flats like radar fences. The nulls harden at choke points. The tones coordinate the handoff. Here's where the physics and the fear meet. Non-cavitating displacement is a lab dream for us. For them, it's standard. Bubble phase control, microbubbles seating ahead of an object to prevent pressure collapse, lets a body move without tearing itself to pieces. Boundary layer manipulation, fields that keep flow attached, removes the drag spike. You get speed without screaming. Add trench geometry as an amplifier. And you get corridors where even a 550-knot transit leaves nothing but a Doppler ghost and a polite tone. Complications don't go away. A shield that can blind our sensors can blind anything. A field that can press on a diver's bones can press harder if it decides to. And consent never enters the protocol. The system doesn't ask. It shapes. But I can't ignore the places where harm looks like byproduct, not intent. The rashes, the metallic taste, the nausea that quits when the window closes. If you build a wall from sound and pressure, biology is going to feel it. People become collateral to a boundary that isn't about them. Back to the map. The arcs prefer abyssal edges, not shipping lanes. The nulls favor canyon heads, not harbors. The tone shows up at the seam where deep water becomes human water. That seam is where an interception makes sense. Meanwhile, a handful of incidents suggest someone waves us through when we stumble into the line. The final transit proved it. The corridor opened like a curtain and closed behind. No collision, no threat, just a choreographed pass. So yes, the base, system, grid, whatever word keeps you honest, reads like defense at scale. It catches what we can't see coming. It shapes the medium to blunt an approach, not to occupy a city. It doesn't care who runs the ship. It cares how you move near the threshold. And if you move right, it ignores you. Shield for whom is still the question that stings. But if a hand is raised between the abyss and our shelves, the first job isn't to terrify us. It's to keep a promise we didn't know needed keeping. Alternative: total control over the sea. There's another reading of the map, and it's the one Navy's whisper when the doors close. Forget shields. Think management. Routes forced. Sensors blinded. Navigation drift imposed like a thumb on a compass. If you can open a corridor, you can shut one. If you can draw a velvet wedge, you can lay a roadblock across a strait without a single buoy or patrol. Start with the obvious. A schedule followed us around the globe. Pre-event quieting, field set, tone gate, controlled release. That cadence imposes a clock on anyone who moves. Move out of window, and sensors gray out. Move inside, and your gear plays nice if you match the envelope. That's not protection. That's curfew. The economics sharpen the edge. Undersea cables are arteries. When a black square sits over a trunk and environmental decorrelation cues automated reroutes, bandwidth gets priced by detour. Insurance adjusts. A shipping consortium pays a surcharge to avoid a corridor it can't name, and the letter never says why. Mineral leases on the slope go quiet after temporary impairments. A drill ship pulls anchor and burns 6 days of cost to sit outside a wedge that isn't supposed to exist. That's leverage without a single declaration. Governance can't catch up because it was never built for this. Law of the sea talks flags, not fields. There's no treaty for non-state, non-human infrastructure rearranging how sound moves. No clause covers transmedium contingencies, except in contractor NDAs written by people who know they can't write what they mean. If you want a practical definition of control, watch bureaucrats invent euphemisms to survive a reality they can't name. Counterpoints keep the room honest. Internal waves bend sonar, thermoclines shift, eddies make radar dumb, gas plumes mess with acoustics. Good science. But none of those show up synchronized across oceans, marching with a timetable, anticipating heading changes, then mirroring themselves in fiber diagnostics. Weather doesn't enforce compliance. Tides don't run handshake protocols. Natural explanations melt when a tone steps right after a helmsman twitches and a GPS drifts, corrects, and logs nothing but the exact nudge the tone predicted. Meanwhile, the managed ocean shows up in places that hurt pride. A naval exercise pre-brief promises detection metrics. The range fills with training targets. At H hour, a wedge goes velvet, target returns fold, and the after-action replaces failure with environmental decorrelation. The squadron commander doesn't complain. He quietly moves the exercise line 80 miles and pretends that was the plan. In the files, a single line, non-attributable interference. That phrase is the sound of a superpower learning it's a tenant, not a landlord. Civilian navigation feels the leash too. A ferry's AIS shows micro kinks along a mapped arc that the crew never logged. A yacht's autopilot ticks a fraction of a degree without command. Fishing boats thread holes they can't name because over the radio someone says, "Don't cut that elbow after dark." That's governance by rumor because the system that governs doesn't sign notices to mariners. Here's the detail that made me stop calling this anything but control. The tone isn't merely a warning, it's a gate that administers access by behavior. Step spacing at trench A matches spacing at trench B months later. A distributed grid, same key, same lock. Ships that mimic the envelope get waved through. Those that don't get velvet. That's a permit system without a counter, enforced by physics, not policy. Add the human nervous system to the ledger. If the field can nudge electronics and instruments, it can nudge bodies, headaches, metallic taste, nausea at onset, relief at release. Deterrence shifts from ships to people. You don't have to break a hull when you can make a bridge crew quiet and compliant for 4 minutes at a time. Stack those windows along a strait, and you've built a soft blockade. Nobody needs to admit it exists. They just reroute. This isn't speculative when the budget lines answer. Oceanic resilience shows up after Null spikes. NDAs talk temporary impairments. Ports shrug off anomaly reports because acknowledging them forces liability. Insurers price in corridors they can't name, transforming a physics footprint into a balance sheet policy. That's control measured in premiums and delays. What nobody knew at the time was how quickly the story would learn to erase itself. A hobbyist's logs vanish after a quiet sail. A lab pivots to whales. A captain resigns and stops answering email. The system doesn't confront. It edits. It trims the edges until the only people left talking sound like they're selling legends, while the corridors keep moving freight and warships around like chess pieces. So yes, maybe there's a shield. But the behavior we can prove looks like management, global, indifferent, exact. It doesn't negotiate. It sets conditions. It doesn't warn. It enforces. And if you accept that, you're left with a colder thought. Consent isn't part of the ocean anymore. Someone else writes the hours. Someone else draws the lanes. And we sail by permission we don't receive in words. The 8 to 10 minute spike echo, physical coercion case study. While we argued about shields and control, the ocean answered with a timer. It happened on a platform 200 miles offshore, a steel city on legs where routine is religion. At 3:11, the alarm cascade started. First a pressure sensor screaming high, then a gas monitor tripping, then a fire panel chiming with no smoke. Workers woke into noise and red light, grabbed hard hats, and ran drills they'd practiced 100 times. Then something new hit. A sound you felt more than heard, a sub-bass thrum that lived in bone. The control room logged it as internal thunder. That's the phrase the foreman used when he called the shore office. Internal thunder, 8 to 10 minutes, can't pin it to anything. He wasn't being dramatic. Watches ticked through those minutes like syrup. People reported the same sequence. A pressure behind the ears, a copper taste, a dizziness that didn't spin the room but flattened it. One man touched a handrail and pulled away like it burned. The thermocouple on that rail never moved off ambient. Sensors went sympathetic. The barometers micro-fluctuated, tiny seesaws at 1 Hz intervals, superimposed on a steady line. Calibrated equipment misbehaved in chorus. Flow meters read low, then high. One torque sensor stepped down as if someone had lifted load off a motor without changing the motor. The crew chief hit reset on half the panels and watched them come back clean, only to drift into nonsense when the thrum deepened. It lasted 8 minutes, 52 seconds by their clock. A long time when alarms are chanting and your stomach argues with gravity. Then the cascade quieted like a choir cut mid-verse. Gauges settled. People breathed. The foreman stood still and listened to a room that suddenly remembered how to be a room. He wrote duration 9 minutes on his whiteboard and circled it twice. The medical officer logged 3 nosebleeds, 5 migraines, and a cluster of pulse spikes without exertion. The clinic ashore called it anxiety. The crew called it the echo. Here's the part that made it more than a bad night. When the platform's raw data got pulled for diagnostics, an engineer noticed the barometric microfluctuations lined up with acoustic null windows flagged by a passive buoy 20 miles south. 5-minute pre-shush, velvet field, tone onset, release. The platform felt the schedule without running a single hydrophone. It lived under the footprint and carried the rhythm in its steel. Where the buoy went quiet, the platform's gauges hummed their tiny seesaw, then relaxed with the tone's fade. 2 systems, same metronome. They weren't the only case. A rig in another ocean logged heavy quiet episodes with the same 8 to 10 minute span, months apart, different contractors. A wind farm reported inverter miscalibrations that only occurred when a mapped corridor shifted under their cable run. A research station saw lab scales drift off 0, then snap back precisely on the same minute their coastal array marked a tone step. Different hardware, common cadence. On the platform, the human pattern mattered more. Migraines clustered in the first 5 minutes. Nosebleeds hit during the tone's rise, then stopped at plateau. The metallic taste ended before the field released, like a prepayment of discomfort. People who never got seasick sat down on the floor and closed their eyes because standing felt like a promise they couldn't keep. The foreman ordered coffee in silence. The crew complied with both. Skeptics did their job. Could low-frequency machinery resonance have entrained the room? They tested the deck plates. The signature didn't match any known drive frequency, and it shifted in lockstep with the off-platform tone step. Could a weather front have pushed the barometers? Fronts don't oscillate at 1 Hz for 9 minutes and stop on the second. Could gas pockets under the legs have burped? The structural monitors showed no load change. The torque sensor's step returned to baseline like a machine finished patting its own head. Meanwhile, the insurer asked quiet questions and flagged the event as environmental. Premiums didn't spike, they crept. The operator installed redundancy and wrote new protocols. Quiet rooms, lights down, expect 8 to 10 minutes of equipment drift. They trained crews to breathe in time with a thing that never announced itself. Deterrence moved from hulls to bodies. You don't need to damage a platform if you can make everyone on it compliant for 9 minutes whenever you choose. The echo repeated elsewhere like a superstition you can schedule. A survey ship transited a mapped arc at night and felt the internal thunder, while every gyroscope drew a soft sign on its log. A naval test barge recorded a heartbeat in steel that nobody on deck could hear, just feel, while passive receivers nearby stepped their tones like a metronome counting a dance they weren't invited to. 2 continents apart, the 8 to 10 minute window held like a policy. Here's where intent knotted the stomach. The echo didn't slam. It guided physiology toward quiet. Workers didn't panic. They complied. They sat. They waited. They learned that resisting made the nausea worse. Obedience became a survival skill. If a field can shape sensors and muscle in the same breath, it doesn't have to threaten. It can persuade. And if it can do that on a rig, it can do that on a bridge, a sub, a port tower, anywhere the footprint falls. That's the authority collapse moment. Realizing the safety brief won't save you from a system that can reach into your body. Patterns across oceans argue against coincidence. The spike is an echo of the larger machine. The pre-event hush, the velvet, the tone, the release, written into bodies and bars. When instruments miscalibrate en masse for 9 minutes at a time, and people bend to a rhythm they can't hear, you're not being warned. You're being managed. The platform crew put it plainly over coffee after the second event. When it wants quiet, the foreman said, we go quiet. And the ocean kept its timer. The meetings they buried, memos, redirects, budget lines. The paper trail didn't shout. It mumbled in margins and line items that looked like housekeeping. The first memo we saw came from an interagency meeting nobody would admit hosting. Subject line, maritime environment, transient decorrelations. Attendance, redacted boxes. The body read like a weather report written by a lawyer. Observed temporary impairments to acoustic situational awareness in discrete volumes proximal to continental margins. No mention of wedges or tones. One sentence, though, did too much work. Adaptive responses are recommended at the operational and procurement levels. While that was happening in Washington, a budget rider slid through under oceanic resilience. The number wasn't huge by Pentagon standards, but it bought very specific things. Deployable shelters for temporary impairments, modular power isolation kits, and a curious line for field portable passive monitoring packages. The packages matched a shopping list Reyes once drafted on a napkin. Ears you can scatter fast. Why buy ears if you're not supposed to hear anything? A second meeting note, different agency, same tone, floated the phrase environmental decorrelation like a life raft. The minutes listed action items. Coordinate with commercial operators to ensure continuity of service routing under transient conditions. Translation. Tell the cable companies to reroute around squares that move without asking why the squares exist. The telecom rep, nameless and polite, asked about cause. The note records, deferred to technical annex. The annex wasn't attached. Contractor NDAs started carrying language that didn't belong in civil maritime work. Transmedium contingencies. Non-cooperative environment. Temporary loss of situational awareness windows. A clause forbade recording in sensitive volumes, defined not by coordinates, but by field conditions consistent with environmental decorrelation. That's how you draw a map without drawing one. You define a feeling. Reyes watched from the cheap seats as the culture shifted. A request to preserve raw wave files got redirected to compliance, environmental. A FOIA came back with a map whose most important square was black. The square sat over the coordinates cluster where nulls pinched and patrol arcs met. The cover letter said the blackout protected critical habitat. The Gulf of Compliance had annexed physics. Across town, an industry lunch served sandwiches and euphemisms. Insurance actuaries asked about uninsurable corridors without using the word corridor. A Port Authority rep mentioned operationally degraded volumes and got a nod that meant we all agree to agree. After coffee, a defense contractor showed a slide titled Resilience in Transient Maritime Environments. The bullets were bland, redundancy, modular routing, crew wellness. The image behind them was a stylized wave that looked a lot like a wedge. What nobody knew at the time was that the procurement breadcrumb trail matched the spike months after each null bloom. Budgets don't move on rumor. They move on pain. A rig logs an 8 to 10 minute echo. 2 quarters later, a purchase order arrives for crew quiet rooms with RF shielding and acoustic dampening. A research vessel reports time drift and rashes. Next budget, a line for onboard physiological monitoring during transient events. Names avoided physics. Money bought compliance. A mid-level staffer, tired eyes, careful hands, slid us a stack of anonymized slides from cross-sector coordination. They were master classes in not saying the thing. Environmental. Decorrelation stood in for blindness. Temporary impairments for nerves turned to glass. Continuity of operations for rerouting warships and freight around invisible fences. One slide included a checklist. Pre-event readiness, reduce emissions, stabilize sensors, prepare crew. Pre-event. Someone had a calendar. Meanwhile, the contractor playbook hardened. Bid packages required familiarity with Transmedium contingencies. Vendors pitched systems that didn't fix physics, they managed people. One brochure showed a bridge bathed in blue light, crew wearing soft headsets, screens dimmed to reduce perceptual conflict during transient states. The human nervous system was an integration point now. Protocols taught breathing and stillness. Installations came with a wellness consultant. Skeptics in the room tried to keep the tent poles up. Bureaucratic jargon doesn't prove an alien base, they said. Agencies coin phrases to soften hits. Fair. But timing does its own arithmetic. Memos spike after silence, fields move. Budgets follow null blooms like a shadow. NDAs acquire the same 2 phrases months after a corridor opens and closes during a Navy range day. You can call it correlation. You can also call it choreography. A FOIA appeal returned a single page with 1 sentence intact. Coordinate with foreign partners to avoid overlapping operations within sensitive volumes. No coordinates. No partners named. But sensitive volumes don't respect borders, and neither did the procurement spend. Allied navies began buying the same kits, training crews in the same breathing protocols, pushing the same euphemisms across desks. The grid didn't need treaties. It had minutes. Unknown to them, across a harbor bar, a junior port officer scribbled fog wall again in a notebook and added a star next to insurance memo, surcharge explained verbally. He didn't know he was documenting a policy. He just knew ships were taking the long way around invisible lines and nobody would tell him why. The last breadcrumb was petty and perfect. A meeting invite leaked with the subject, environmental decorrelation, lessons learned. The purpose we can't confirm, the pattern we can't ignore. 2 paths sat on the table like matched blades. One read defense, arcs as fences, wedges as shields, tones as orderly handoffs that keep something from crossing our shelves. The other read control, corridors as leash points, velvet as blindfold, tones as a gate that grants or denies on command. Purpose stayed fog, pattern didn't. Start with what never wavered. The sequence, pre-event quieting, field set, tone gate, controlled release. Held across oceans, months, and hardware. It ignored flags. It aligned with trench mouths, shelf breaks, fracture zones, cable trunks. It moved against wind and current, favored canyon heads, and anticipated heading changes with a precision that turned skepticism into an accounting problem. That's a system behaving like it knows its job. If it's a shield, its logic is simple. Patrol the abyssal edge, harden choke points, open for compliant traffic, escort the wobbly out of danger, and absorb the cost of collateral biology. In that story, the rashes, the metallic taste, the nausea become fallout from a pressure architecture doing work at scale. You don't tune fields for human capillaries if your priority is stopping a 550-knot transit from below. You accept that people will feel it and keep the line. If it's control, the same moves become policy. Blind sensors at will. Impose a timetable. Shape lanes without stating them. Teach crews to obey by making resistance hurt and compliance easy. You don't need to jam radios or deploy ships. You redefine the medium. Ports shrug, insurers price it in, militaries write euphemisms, and the sea becomes administered space without a single new buoy. Both readings fit the geometry. Only intent differs, and intent is the one thing the machine never reveals. It signals state, not motive. It speaks in step spacing and envelopes, not in declarations. That tension isn't theoretical. It lives in the gap between safety and consent. Protection at scale, harm up close. A corridor that opens when you behave, a skull that aches when you don't. We're either beneficiaries of a boundary we didn't ask for, or tenants under management we didn't vote on. Meanwhile, people remain the measure. Sailors learning to sit through 9-minute echoes because it keeps the room from tilting. Divers tapping out when bone-deep pressure arrives with no depth change. Researchers writing dermatitis on forms they don't believe. Crews being waved through, gently, and imagining what it looks like when the hand doesn't wave. What nobody knew at the time, until the overlays made it vulgar, was how clean the choreography got when you stacked incidents by Greenwich time. Windows moved like a relay around the world. Corridor dim, gap bloom elsewhere reset. No storm travels that way, no seismic train keeps that beat. Someone scheduled the ocean and used geology as hardware. If there's a thesis sentence for this entire file, it's that the sea is being operated. So you ask the last practical question: cooperate or contest? Cooperation sounds like humility. Learn the envelope, map the hours, train crews to breathe and wait, harvest the predictable openings, and try not to get in the way of something larger than navies. Contest sounds like fantasy. Project counterfields into a medium they sculpt better than we do, risk cavitation wars we can't hear, and escalate against a system that can close doors you don't even know you're approaching. The management hypothesis cuts the difference in a way that doesn't comfort anyone. They patrol, they shape, they ignore our laws. Not enemies, not allies. Operators whose goals intersect ours when it suits physics and part ways when it doesn't. Cooperation is irrelevant because consent was never requested. You move when the corridor opens, or you sit in velvet until it does. You don't bargain with a weather front, you plan around it. Except weather doesn't anticipate your rudder and mirror your mistakes. Human stakes snap the camera back to faces. Fishermen threading rumor holes. A helmsman nudging 2 degrees and feeling the tone answer. A platform foreman counting 9 minutes out loud because his crew steadies on numbers. A junior officer writing fog wall again with a star and wondering why insurance memo, explained verbally, feels like a confession. The pattern feeds their routines. It rewrites seamanship into choreography. This was the moment everything changed for us in the room. We'd been careful with words, allergic to certainty, disciplined about sources. But the map didn't care about our caution. The system kept its appointments. The tone stepped when behavior stepped. The field opened when envelopes held. When a sub drifted toward bad rock, an escort slid alongside and peeled away at the shelf. When a Navy range spun up, a wedge went velvet, and the after-action wrote poetry to avoid saying blind. Meaning is the piece we can't certify. The pattern is the part we can't ignore. Shield, or control, the effect is identical at the bridge. Permission replaces mastery. The sea, once contested, is curated by an operator that doesn't announce itself, doesn't miss its schedule, and doesn't need to argue. Our plans bend around a physics we don't own. A planned transit through a corridor with passive ears would settle nothing about motive. It would resolve everything about agency. If the curtain opens, someone decided to open it. If it closes, someone chose to close it. That's what we set out to test. Not why, who, or more precisely, whether there's a who that acts like a who. And when the hour came, the ocean kept the appointment. The final transit, crossing the threshold. We chose a window the map wouldn't argue with, quiet before dawn, when the patrol arcs usually reset. No pings, no bravado. A small steel hull with redundancy baked in and ears everywhere. Reyes stood at the chart table with the younger analyst and the captain, and they agreed on the rule that mattered. No sudden moves. If the system was a lock, we'd act like a key. If it was a wall, we'd learn the shape of the bruise. This was the heist moment, the climax. except the vault door could feel our pulse. The crew was briefed like divers before a cave. Health protocols on a whiteboard: hydration, slow breathing, eyes off screens if nausea hits, call symptoms fast. Lights dimmed to amber. Recorders rolled, hydrophones, black box mics, magnetometer, EM sniffers, 3 clocks on independent sync, and a 4th analog face taped to the bridge glass because sometimes plastic needles tell truths software forgets. We eased toward the known edge at 6 knots, nose pointed along the isobath that had coughed up the cleanest toned steps months earlier. The sea was plain. The graph was not. 5 minutes out, the floor hushed. Shrimp chorus faded. Surface hiss thinned. Pre-event quieting arrived like a held breath. The captain put 2 fingers on the helm and held them there as if pressure could keep a promise. Then the tone arrived. Low, narrow, baseline where it should be. The analyst raised a hand, not for silence. We were already quiet, but for rhythm. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The band went velvet. The world didn't. On deck, a container seemed ticked once like cooling metal. Below, the magnetometer twitched, then steadied. The helm stayed steady. Nobody tested the envelope. A second tone laid itself over the first, thinner and a touch higher. A guideline tracing alongside a road you can't see. Baseline held. No step. The curtain opened, and we felt it without drama. Not a shove, not a pull, absence. The returns that should have been there were not. And what replaced them was a soft clarity, like fog that agrees to act like air. The captain whispered that the wheel felt light. He didn't move it. We entered the Null's body the way you enter a chapel. Heads down, clocks up, ritual over rhetoric. The tone stayed polite. Baseline. Baseline. The second line wavered, then settled a half step up. The analyst mouthed the label he'd never gotten to publish. Hold. The corridor was open. The gate was watching. This is the moment viewers feel in their gut. Permission replacing mastery. That's when the electronics went off beat. Not failure, drift. The GPS laid a hair of correction onto our track without asking. The autopilot clicked as if acknowledging a gentle advisory it hadn't received. The analog clock ticked true. The black box clock slid a second, then 2, in the same lazy way we'd seen on the research vessel. The medic checked faces. Pupils normal. One crewman swallowed, nodded, and breathed like he'd practiced. Halfway through, the sea returned in layers. A faint scatter of far-off hiss, then a skin of chop, then the suggestion of a contact that wasn't there until it was, then wasn't. Doppler ghosts painted and unpainted themselves like the idea of motion without the cost. If something crossed us at speed, it left no screen. Only a smear in phase, like wind seen through grass not heard. We didn't change heading. That mattered. The tone watched for mistakes and never got fed. When a swell lifted the bow, the second line flickered, nodded, and fell back. The crew rode the rhythm. The medic wrote, no rash onset. The EM monitor showed a low swell that matched the steps like a breath under a metronome. The magnetometer traced a gentle bow toward nothing and back. A polite bow returned by nobody we could see. 3 minutes in, a shape arrived at the edge of knowledge. Not a blip, not a hull, an outline of allowed space shifting left, as if the corridor itself moved to meet our line and save us the work. The analyst muttered escort behavior and shut up. The captain's fingers never left the wheel. The corridor didn't touch us. It made room. A mile from the exit, the baseline stepped. 1 increment up, hold, then down. The analyst squeezed his pen and said, calm enough to believe himself, gate closing. The captain told the engine room. Steady. We crossed a seam that felt like a temperature change without temperature. Air tasted the same. Mouths didn't. No copper. No ache. Release arrived in a rush that wasn't noisy. The floor came back. Shrimp crackled like 1,000 matches. The surface hissed a sheet of rain that wasn't rain. The tone held for a heartbeat, stepped down, and stopped. The analog clock agreed with network time again, as if it had been offended and forgave us. Nobody cheered. The crew didn't talk. You don't celebrate when you've been allowed through a door you didn't open. The data didn't care about reverence. It stacked itself into evidence, synchronized clocks showing drift and return, EM swell bracketing the velvet, magnetometer bows, Doppler smears where cavitation should have shouted, a second tone riding shotgun like a quiet chaperone. The ocean had an operator, and we had to ask to exist without ever speaking. On the bridge, the captain let his fingers leave the wheel. Reyes looked at the analyst and didn't have to ask. If a corridor opens, someone decided to open it. We didn't prove why. We proved who in the only way that matters at sea. An operator met our behavior with access. The ocean had a user interface. And once you accept that, consent turns into a clock and a heading. The cover and the consequence. The morning after the transit, the paper trail behaved like it had been warned ahead of time. The insurer flagged our voyage with an internal code that reads like dust to anyone outside the room. Anomalous event, environmental. That flipped a switch. A compliance officer called to clarify safety acknowledgments and asked if we could sign an updated form that retroactively recognized transient decorrelation conditions. Post facto consent. A signature to make the past tidy. The Port Authority didn't blink. We handed over the Anomaly report, the timestamps, the graphs that any graduate seminar would hang on a wall. The desk sergeant scanned, nodded, and clipped the packet under a tab he'd used before. Equipment glitches, he said, tone neutral, eyes soft from repetition. He stamped our departure clearance for next week like nothing about the ocean had learned our names. Reyes got the polite version of a knock. Wellness check, evening, 2 officers, no squad car lights, concern painted in gentle words. They asked if he was sleeping, if he felt safe, if anyone had pressured him to fabricate. He invited them in for tea. They declined. They left no card and carried the posture of men who understood their visit was the message, not the questions. 30 minutes later, an email landed from an old supervisor reminding him that public-facing commentary on sensitive maritime conditions could cause confusion. The crew felt the consequence in their inboxes. HR sent updated safety protocols with a fresh checkbox for temporary impairments. The language matched the budget line we'd seen months earlier. A contractors' council attached a rider that limited liability during environmental decorrelations, defined by field conditions, not coordinates. Our helmsman, the one who never twitched during the transit, laughed once, without humor, and initialed every page. Public narrative took shape faster than any of us could upload. A local outlet lifted our port call from AIS records and posted a headline. Research vessel reports equipment issue near trench. The subhead blamed calibration. The comments were clean, too clean. A few asked about the tone. Those were gone by evening. The archived page showed a gap where the brief argument had lived. The edit log read moderation for misinformation. The Navy pretended it hadn't read our file at all. No request for raw, no offer to compare clocks, no denial that meant anything. Silence becomes a policy when acknowledging a door means admitting you don't own the locks. Down at the range office, a friend of a friend told us off record that temporary impairments had moved exercise boxes twice that month. He didn't write it down. He slid his coffee across the table like an apology he couldn't say out loud. Macro consequences never announce themselves with fireworks. They show up in routing software. Shipping lanes bent around corridors we hadn't published. Weather avoidance became the line you feed to a captain who can read a sky and knows you're lying. Quiet reroutes multiplied along abyssal hems. Insurance surcharges hardened from pilot to policy. Cables rebalanced load along longer paths that carried the same traffic with a little more latency and a little less profit. The map looked the same to tourists. To operators, it wore new shoes. Crew consequences landed in small ways that didn't feel small. A deckhand who'd kept his breathing even through the tone woke 2 nights in a row to phantom hums and walked the pier until the water looked like water again. The medic applied for a short leave and wrote family on the form because the sea touched me isn't a category. The analyst updated his resume and deleted a sentence about the transit before he exported the PDF. He saved the version with the sentence in a folder named Drafts. We met in Reyes' kitchen because the diner's coffee had started tasting like a surveillance camera. The room held printouts, drives, a whiteboard with the steps written as if they were a prayer. Quiet, velvet gate, release. Nobody argued about what we'd felt. The argument was about what to do with it. Publish everything and wait for the erasers. Drip details and get called storytellers. Hand the data to someone who can bury it and hope they decide not to. While we talked, the grid kept doing its job. A quiet ping from the volunteer network reported a Null sliding off Tonga into a gap that would touch a cable trunk at dawn GMT. We cross-checked in 3 places. Same schedule, same step spacing. You could set a watch by a thing that didn't own a watch. The belly felt the consequence before the brain caught up. If you can be waved through, you can be shut out or shut down. And that becomes the quiet policy of everyone with skin on a hull. Port pilots share rumor maps at bars. Don't cut the elbow after midnight. run the saddle by the hour, call sick if the fog wall feels like a wall. Insurance actuaries ask for more history and get denials over coffee. Range planners draw box edges with pencils and keep erasers handy. The sea, curated, teaches seamanship by reward and ache. Reyes sent a packet to a Senate staff inbox that had previously answered our emails with stiff politeness. It bounced once, then went through. Days passed. No response. A week later, a staff roundtable convened on maritime resilience. We weren't invited. The transcript landed in a press kit with phrases we could have written as parody months earlier. Environmental decorrelation. Continuity under transient conditions. Crew wellness strategies. The tone never appeared in print. The gate stayed a rumor you could measure. Personal blowback shrank itself into courtesy. A conference organizer rescinded a panel invite and cited agenda adjustments. A colleague who once traded papers with Reyes stopped returning calls. The younger analyst, who'd never been sentimental about any of this, turned down a job at a place that would have required him to swear he hadn't heard what he'd heard. He kept the analog clock from the bridge on his bookshelf and didn't wind it. You can call that a cover. You can call it consequence. It felt like both. The system didn't need to discredit us. It needed to keep its schedule. Institutions moved around that fact like furniture around a load-bearing wall. We learned how to live with it the way sailors learn currents. By pretending your choices are grand theater while the water asks a different question. Did you check the tide? What nobody on the outside will see is the way language changes you. You stop saying storm. You say window. You stop saying failure. You say velvet. You don't talk about sovereignty. You talk about access. And you measure freedom not in miles of open water, but in the seconds between a baseline tone and the step that means the curtain is about to close. We filed the last of the paperwork. We signed the acknowledgments written in a grammar we didn't author. We backed away from the pier. The sea looked like it always looks when you leave at dusk, flat where it will be rough, benign where it remembers. The corridor we crossed didn't show its face. It didn't have to, because once you know there's a hand on the medium, every calm water feels like a decision. The oceans aren't contested. They're administered by an operator that never asks permission and rarely leaves a trace. If a corridor opens, it's because something decided you could pass. Your ocean is no longer yours. This investigation draws on documented cases, field logs, and the published research of investigators including Richard Dolan's USO studies, 1970s, 1980s and beyond, along with interviews from maritime professionals and archival analyses. Attribution here reflects sources that inform the patterns and procedures described. Where identities or specifics could compromise individuals or methods, we have anonymized or composited details. If you've crossed a silent patch, felt the 9-minute echo, or recorded the step tone, tell us exactly where and when. You're not alone. Others have lived this and stayed quiet. Share this with the one person on your crew who watches the clock when the sea goes soft. Subscribe, tap the bell, and add your data below so we can map what authority won't. Are we being shielded from something worse or domesticated in our own waters?